Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are getting into the conclusion of the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda, which for us, like the previous video and this video are like part 1 and part 2 of the conclusion. But even though I didn't necessarily label it that way, my goal was just to simplify the last 5 or 6 issues rather than spreading it out and zooming in on each piece and just causing confusion all along the way. But don't worry, there's still other stories we're gonna do that with. But this one I just wanted to make it simple. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so you can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so with T'Challa successfully passing his trial within the Jalia, this allowed him to then demand the assistance of the ancestors so that they would restore all the memories of every living person from Wakanda, which like we'd seen before is not only on Earth, or technically the moon in this story, but this also extended out through the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda, which at this point stretches across 5 galaxies. But with Emperor N'Jaka's army being built off of having memories wiped, this had then brought the numbers in his army down when a ton of his soldiers remembered that the person likely standing next to them had stripped them from their homes and killed their family. And for Chris, who mentioned in the comments of the last video, like if on site was a picture, like that's exactly what that was. Because once everyone remembered, there was no one there to tell them like, oh, they had their mind wiped too. Nope, memories just came back like a flood, and as soon as they looked over and saw the guy who killed their wife and their children, it was a wrap for them. But also with this happening, in response, Emperor N'Jaka, with his numbers being significantly lower, he knew that T'Challa was then going to call for allies and make an attempt to even the battlefield. So for Emperor N'Jaka, the symbiote, who at this time is having a meeting with Killmonger, with them more or less being forced to play nice and work together, but it's here where they mention that many of their mules, which in this case are both their soldiers and their slaves, who were captured and had their mind wiped, but with everyone having their memories back now, a lot of them did leave to either go find their families or start new ones, but even with that happening, there still were quite a few that stuck around. And I guess in their cases, they just hated their wives and they hated their lives before, I don't know. But even with these remaining numbers of both soldiers and slaves that remained, Eric knew that this wasn't enough. And even on top of that, the addition of him and N'Jaka with the symbiote, that wasn't enough either. And with seeing this is where Eric Killmonger suggests that on top of this, they're going to need to use the power that they'd stolen from Bast, the power of a god, to win this fight. And N'Jaka tells him in response, like, no, not the power of a god, but gods, plural. But then also to take a step back for a second and talk about how things were rounding up while T'Challa was in the Jalia, because it was around this time when Shuri, she had brought in a number of other heroes for help, like Misty Knight, Sam Wilson, Luke Cage, Monica Rambeau, amongst a few others who we'll see show up later. But with doing this, she would use Manifold to get them from Wakanda Prime over to the Maroon Moon base, and with going there, they could protect the main gate that N'Jaka's trying to seize. But with this happening, Bast was highly offended, and we had talked about before with N'Jaka killing her previous avatar and taking the majority of her power, to where then Bast had used N'Jaka's daughter, who he was training to later on take his place, but Bast had pretty much chosen her and switched sides. But with Bast not liking the idea of Shuri using outside help, which for Shuri was just her doing what she felt like she needed to do, but at this point with Bast not really having the power to help them like they need or to the capacity that they need, it then just led Shuri to make this decision that she felt was best for the people of Wakanda. But then for Bast, it was here where she formulated her own plan by paying a visit to Zenzi and striking a deal with her, with Bast knowing that Zenzi is only working for Emperor N'Jaka because she has to. But then on top of that, with Bast also making this secret deal with Zenzi, which is also pretty interesting with N'Jaka's daughter, her name is Zenzi as well, and so Bast had used the Zenzi to go meet the Zenzi. But with this meeting happening, Bast kind of played on the idea of not only the harsh tactics that Emperor N'Jaka had used on Zenzi, but also her knowing and having the experience of being aware that once N'Jaka is done with her, that he's just going to try and kill her. But for Zenzi, she's been there, done that, and as a survivor, she's aware of how to make better of the situation and take the opportunity to get out when she can. But then essentially it's here where Zenzi tells Bast N'Jaka's current weakness, which is the conflict between him and Eric Killmonger, which from there gives Bast the idea on how to exploit that weakness when the time presents itself. But then from here, jumping forward to after T'Challa had came back from the Jalia, it was here where he also learned about the death of Nakia from the Maroons, with her sacrificing herself to essentially buy him time while also minimizing N'Jaka's reinforcements. But with T'Challa coming back in honor of Nakia, they had erected a statue in Wakanda Prime in her honor for her sacrifice. And with showing this to everyone during this war, to where at this point more of the help showed up like Brother Voodoo, Miles Morales, Ironheart, Riri Williams, Nick Fury, Cloak, and more. But with T'Challa putting up this statue, which was mad quick, by the way. But with Wakandan technology, hey, anything's possible. But with showing this statue, he gave this crazy good speech that essentially revolved around like if Nakia, who was born literally light years away from the Golden City and shown the cruelest form of what Wakanda could be, but for her, even with that being the case, if she gave her life in order to preserve and protect the purest form of Wakanda, like how much is everyone else here willing to give? And it was kind of like, man, whoa, that's deep. But with this speech being given, you then had the arrival of the Orisha, which initially had Shuri like, man, that was a good speech, brother, but I don't know if it was that good. But with them showing up, T'Challa had then asked, what exactly does this mean? Because for Shuri, her first thought is with them showing up that they've come here to help in the war. But with T'Challa being skeptical, he has Storm what she thinks with the whole situation from Volume 6 with her joining the Orisha, but Storm also lets him know that she was just as much replacing as she was joining, and with them being silent gods, they had never really kept tabs or even had like a group chat kind of thing going. So for that reason, she also doesn't know why they're here. And in the case of Brother Voodoo, as far as he knows, the Loa and the Orisha, they both work in different spheres, and even though they teamed up at times before, they've also been to war. And because of that, he tells T'Challa like he also doesn't know why exactly they're here, but just from his experience, he tells T'Challa to exercise caution. But then not long after this, when Bast then comes back, and when she does, they immediately think that she's associated with them coming here, and that is not necessarily a good sign. And for T'Challa, with making that assumption, he's half right. Because when Bast gets here, she tells him that I have no part in this, to where which that in itself is the bad news. But with Bast getting here, she just tells T'Challa it has begun, but also what this shows us is that Emperor N'Jaka, who has taken the power of Bast, had not only taken her power, but he had also taken her seat as an Orisha, which is what we had seen him refer to when Emperor N'Jaka was telling Eric Killmonger about using the power of multiple gods. But this doesn't work out in the way of just N'Jaka using the Orisha to just overthrow them, but instead he just more so uses their assistance to send his men here for like an ambush attack and catch the Maroons, the Wakandans, and the different heroes off guard. Okay, now, so with saying this, I feel like I gotta say, because I feel like a lot of people will be like, well, why would the Orisha allow this to happen? And so like as a quick response to that, I want to also say that this story builds off of the history of Wakanda that we were given by Ta-Nehisi Coates in the previous volume of Black Panther. Because at that time when we got the story of the land that we now know as Wakanda being inhabited by the originators who had lived there in peace, but then after some time they were met by the arrival of Wakandan pilgrims, who I guess were just pilgrims at the time because it's not Wakanda yet. But these African pilgrims were led to Wakanda because something mystical in the soil was calling for them. And when they arrived there, the originators, they shared the land with them. But then eventually these pilgrims, they messed it up because they offended the originators by announcing their entitlement to the land because of what was calling them there. And this had caused the two of them to break out into a war. But then throughout this war, a number of these pilgrims were then selected as hosts for the gods who had called them to this land. And so when these men and women transformed into gods, they had then effectively overthrew the originators, taking the land for their own, and when doing so they had imprisoned and banished the originators to the nether realms. So even when Emperor N'Jaka had taken Bast's position, their loyalty had pretty much stayed the same, with them not only honoring the strongest warriors of Wakanda, or in this case the descendants of those pilgrims, but in its most basic form, the Orisha are allowing Wakanda to have like this civil war, if you will. And however that may turn out, they're just gonna side with the victor rather than personally get involved and take the side of either one or the other. Because in either case, whoever wins, it's still their people, and the Orisha are gonna support them either way. But as far as the Orisha, what they're not gonna do is push their own people off of the land that they call them to. And in this case, their involvement, it only goes as far as setting the stage and just seeing which leader comes out on top. But with N'Jaka using his position to orchestrate this as an ambush, this then leads up to the face-off between him and T'Challa. And I'm sure this part also begs another question, and this one has been on my mind, and I kind of figured you guys would be thinking the same, because with N'Jaka quote-unquote taking the power of Bast, there's then like this question of why doesn't he just then depower the Black Panther? And with how this is done, we don't necessarily get a direct answer to that here, but even nonetheless, with us seeing that Bast, even in her depowered state, is still a god, but even with that, the strength of the Black Panther is still connected to Bast herself. So if Bast is reduced to like 10%, just to make up a number, then T'Challa will only get 10% of the damage buff than he would usually get. And like a number of things, that's not one of the things that's spelled out here, but we do get references to it throughout the story. Because with what Bast is working on in the background, she then again mentions that N'Jaka hasn't taken all of her power. But nonetheless, here and now, between N'Jaka and T'Challa, this fight is clearly a mismatch, and it's here where the other kicker comes in, which isn't like pivotal in the entire fight, at least not in a huge way, but it is something super huge that happens that I've at least got to mention. Because when I mentioned Shuri collecting allies for the fight, you then also had the case of her mother Ramonda, who's T'Challa's stepmother, who had opened the ancient doors under Wakanda, reaching into the Netherrealm prison, to where she had then solicited the help of the originators who the Wakandans had long ago imprisoned. And this is pretty huge because this land of Wakanda was originally theirs. And so with seeing this, you would think like on the surface, like why would these guys even help Wakanda now? Because these guys were beaten by their ancestors and the Orisha and imprisoned within the Netherrealm for what was said at one point to be eons. Which I guess makes sense because we also got a Black Panther from 1 million BC. But the question that's begged here is why all of a sudden would they team up with Wakanda and help defend them from getting overthrown? But as it turns out, like one, they don't have much of a better option. So for them, any deal is a sweet deal, really. But then also the second thing is that Ramonda tells them that she can never make up for the things that her ancestors have done. But if the originators help Wakanda Prime win this civil war, then from this day moving forward, they would also be considered as citizens of Wakanda, both in Wakanda Prime and across the 5 galaxies. And initially the originators think like they're being mocked with this offer like in the first place, because the only quote Wakandans that they know are the ancestors who had taken their land. But the thing that makes the originators agree and take this deal is that if nothing else, they recognize that their gods had forsaken them long ago. So for them, rather than desiring to be restored back to the people that they were, it's here where they find the offer more appealing to join with Wakanda Prime, who in their case, their god has sustained them to this day, but also it gives them the opportunity of retribution with allowing the originators to take the fight to Emperor N'Jaka and his empire, who very much still stand with the old ways of the Orisha. And once again, this isn't one of the things that necessarily turn the tides like in a huge way, but it more so evens the playing field against the numbers of those who are still on the side of Emperor N'Jaka. But aside from the originators coming back and joining the fight, which is one of the parts of the story that I really enjoyed, because for a long time they kind of just felt like a throwaway origin from like 2016, so I like that they're brought back here and given some purpose more or less, while also with doing so showing that Wakanda Prime that they're not only fighting for the cause of good and the true freedom of their people, but also in the process they want to right the wrongs of their ancestors, because you can't just be this nation about not colonizing when that's exactly what your nation was built upon. So in a way, this was also like their attempt to make that right, with the current leaders freeing those that their ancestors had imprisoned. But then also in the case of the ancestors watching all of this go down, they of course are siding with T'Challa, who has not only repeatedly earned their respect and their readmission, but with time they've come to accept the way that T'Challa wants to lead his people, regardless of their differences in opinion, because he's repeatedly proven himself to be a worthy king. But between N'Jaka and T'Challa, like the fight goes back and forth for quite a bit, and at one point N'Jaka does get the upper hand, and when this happens, it's here where Storm and Monica Rambeau step in, to where as a reminder, it was Monica Rambeau who had killed Eric Killmonger the last time. So with her knowing Eric Killmonger was back, her and Storm had then come up with like a combo move to use on him, but in this case it presents a problem, because if Monica Rambeau were to kill Eric Killmonger again, or even more importantly destroy N'Jaka, but this would interfere with the plans of Bast of taking her power back, but also seeing through the outcome that she intends when all of this is said and done. And it's because of this where she uses Zenzi to control Vibraxis in order to attack Monica Rambeau and stop her, which then also makes it seem like Bast is working against them, which really wasn't the case. But with Bast working alongside with Zenzi for her own motive, which she hasn't shared with T'Challa, like on the surface it very much looks like betrayal, and apparently it smells like it too. But then when this happens, you also have a point to where Gentle, he steps in, and when he does, he's then stopped by Tetu, who while doing this, Tetu's kind of bragging like no prison can hold me, and with saying this, T'Challa's pretty much just like, yeah, you right, and so he then comes through with the Spirit Bashenga, and he kills Tetu because he figures, hey, if prison didn't work, let's try something else. But when T'Challa calls back for the Spirit Bashenga, it instead goes to N'Jaka, with it being a weapon that is imbued by the power of the Orisha, and in this case, when N'Jaka being a member of the Orisha, he's able to call for the Spirit Bashenga, and when he does, he takes it and he breaks it in half. But then it's also here where we see the plan of Bast come into play, because even though Monica Rambeau could have just killed Killmonger and Emperor N'Jaka, Bast didn't want that to happen because she needed this to end a specific way for a specific reason. And even though the explanation for that is given to us in a very cryptic manner, I'll get into more of why that was in just a minute. But then it's here in part of Bast's plan, to where she uses N'Jaka's daughter to get his attention and pull him away from Eric Killmonger, but with doing this, she's planned for some time to set the stage for T'Challa to defeat N'Jaka. But the reason that Bast needed it to happen this way specifically, and once again it's given to us in a very cryptic and obscure type of fashion, but the reason that she needed T'Challa to defeat N'Jaka, it was because she needed T'Challa to be the victor in order for her to return to the Orisha. But once her plan started playing out, it was then when the others started to realize she was still on their side, which then kind of gives this moment of Shuri helping out, with her hitting N'Jaka and Eric with a huge ball and chain. But then it was here when Bast gave T'Challa the remaining piece of the spear of Bashinga, and it's here where she told him, I need you to put the spear or the blade where it belongs. But with this being done and T'Challa killing Eric Killmonger, who was effectively Emperor N'Jaka's champion, which was kind of a situation where he was trying to flip it to be his own champion. But with T'Challa doing this as a champion of Bast, she had then given up the body of N'Jaka's daughter, Princess Zenzi, to where she had then transferred herself to the original Zenzi, and with doing so making the original Zenzi her new host. To where from there, Bast had then taken back the rest of her power, fully restoring Bast and making Zenzi the current host. And with this happening, on one hand it kind of gave the story of things going in a full circle of what Bast had given to the Wakandans, which now has grown into 5 galaxies, which in this case has come back all the way around, with her people restoring her and making her new in a sense. But with this happening, we also get this moment to where T'Challa and Storm, they more or less go off on Bast for her allowing the corruption that had taken place and her not doing anything about N'Jaka's rise to power and billions being taken into slavery, and they pretty much tell her that much of the suffering that happened, it was her fault because she did nothing, which isn't necessarily true because she did restore T'Challa's memories, which essentially is the part that turned all of this around. But essentially with them blaming her for the suffering of billions, she then lets them know that truth be told, she can't take the credit for all this. Because really and truly, as bad as things turned out on the Intergalactic Empire, with N'Jaka killing the former emperor and taking over, and them expanding across 5 galaxies and accumulating more vibranium, but even with this being the case, this was all started when T'Challa sent that Alpha Flight ship and established this empire to begin with. And now with T'Challa taking it back, not only is he the emperor of 5 galaxies, but he's also done this without compromising his integrity. And at the end of the day, the people of Wakanda as a whole, who are now also referred to as a legion, they're much greater because of it. And not to mention, like with all of this happening, you also have the case of the originators, who were not only freed from the Netherrealm, but they also had then got their own planet at the end of it, with them getting the planet Oshun rather than them being locked in the Netherrealm till the end of time. But with Wakanda being infinitely greater than it was, because of what Bast had supposedly allowed to happen, she lets T'Challa know, like, if you're gonna be mad at anybody, be mad at yourself first, and then after that you can come back to me. But from there, Bast then leaves to settle things with the Orisha, and when she does, Aurora or Storm, she lets T'Challa know that Bast was right, because regardless of what had happened in between and how Wakanda had become an empire, nonetheless it is an empire, T'Challa is the emperor, and this could be seen as either his fault or to his credit. But nonetheless, their territory has expanded, and from here forward beyond Wakanda Prime, Wakanda now extends across these 5 galaxies. But also with this happening, like the guilt that T'Challa expresses, which we more so get with him thinking of those who are lost along the way, and him wishing that they could see Wakanda for what it is now. But like for the most part, this focuses on him thinking of Nakia, who had fought alongside with him most of the way, to where she eventually gave her life just for the possibility for this to happen. And with T'Challa thinking and wishing that she could see this, because really he feels like she's missing out on the spoils of their victory. But then on the flip side, during the ceremony where T'Challa is crowned, we're then shown Nakia, to where in her case, she witnesses the new beginning of the expansion of the Jalia, which again is the plane of Wakandan memory and home of the ancestors, which is now also the home of all the ancestors of the 5 different galaxies that make up the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. So now we finally finished the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda. And at this point, I'm just super curious to know you guys' thoughts down in the comments, because even though it was like just 25 issues, but like this series was dense. And I couldn't help but notice, like with checking out online reviews and seeing a lot of people being pulled either way with this one, and not even so much because they felt like it was a bad story, but a lot of people would either get lost between the flashbacks, which would start in one issue, cut off, and then pick up like 2 issues later, and do so in the middle of other linear events. But then also this would happen while many things were kept a mystery until many issues later, which really made it easy to get lost in the sauce. But also because of that, I think it's one of those volumes that's just better read straight through from start to finish. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.